G'day fans and welcome to another exciting episode of Sci-Fi Zone. How groovy is this? It's nice and warm outside. Like all good fans, you should be out and enjoying the absolutely beautiful weather, but instead we've decided to stay indoors. What can I say? It is so hot, it's like a ruckus out there at the moment. What do you reckon there, Miss Claire? Good to see you back on the show.
Yeah, good to be back. It has been a lovely day here.
Yeah, exactly right. This is very, 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 very cool. So we've got actually a bit of a big one tonight. We're going to be discussing the new Dune movie, or if you like the Vile, you call it Dunny. So I've always thought that was actually quite good and quite funny. So you know what? We've actually been, instead of normally going through the process of saying what we've been doing each week, regarding our sci-fi stuffs, I think we should just stop mucking around and just get straight into it. What do you reckon? There we go. Look at that. The Vile has actually said, good to see a bit of the old Dunny. Absolutely love it. Now, we know that some people won't be interested in this at all. And I think good old William has said he's not a Dune fan by any stretch. So sorry, William, you're going to be pretty bored for tonight. But we're looking at just tucking straight into the good old film and seeing what we think, and be very curious to see what everybody else's opinions happen to be. If you haven't seen it, be aware, yes, there will be spoilers. We're not mucking around. We assume that most people already know the story because there's been 3 iterations of the film already. So we're just going to get straight into it. No hiding the facts of the story at all. So Claire, now a couple of things I want to bring up before we get to your thoughts and views. So actually, yeah, so it's 2 things to be aware of. So one is that we're not going to compare this to the 1984 movie, which I'm a huge fan of, unless we find that there's a link between the two. So our aim is not to compare one against the other. We're going to look at this one as a separate piece of work, but there will be occasions where we have to reference the 84 movie because there's similarities between the two. So there you go. And it's actually quite interesting to see how that all works out. Anyway, kick off. So Claire, so you saw a bit of the old Dunny, as it were. What were your thoughts?
I loved it. I just loved it. It was beautiful to watch. The music was great. It made sense, which was something I was a little bit unsure about. The casting was great. For me, the casting was absolute standout. There were some of the choices they made they just worked brilliantly. So yeah, overall rating, yeah, absolutely loved it. Looking forward to the next one already.
Oh, there you go. Actually, that sort of brings it up a very interesting point about the fact the film was cut into 2 bits. And as someone else had mentioned to me, and I wasn't even aware of this, in the poster doesn't even say part 1. So if you were, when the movie started, if you were too busy switching your phone off when the title came up and you didn't see the part 1 bit, you wouldn't know that it finished where it didn't. Go, oh, is that the end of the story? It's just cut off. So I know there's been a lot of criticisms from people saying, well, the fact that it's been split into 2 because the book was never split into 2, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether part 2 will match part 1 is anybody's guess. But do you find that that's actually potentially going to be an issue, that it's spread over 2 movies?
No, I think it's actually a good thing. I think they picked a really good spot to stop it. There was obviously more to come. They gave just a couple of little hints at the end of sort of what was coming next and what we have to look forward to in the next movie. But I also think it gave them much more scope to tell the story better. I know we're not comparing it to the 80s movie, but one of the things about that was that it's a hugely complicated story. And I mean, I haven't read the book. I don't, that, Dags, I don't know if anyone else realizes. I haven't read the book. So the story is not particularly familiar to me, but it was told really well. Like, you could understand what was going on. There were bits of complications, but not too many. And just one piece of comparison in particular was that in the 84 movie, there was a lot of exposition. There was a lot of, someone just telling you over the top of the picture what was going on and what had been happening. And there was very little of that in this movie, and I think it worked really well. So I think giving themselves the chance to slow it down a little bit and not try to fit so much into one movie was a really good choice.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I certainly agree with that. The fact that being able to spread it out is actually a very good move. I guess in hindsight, had they been able to do it all in one 4-hour epic, it would have been better, but clearly would have cost twice as much. They obviously didn't have the money for it. So there's probably a whole lot of reasons. Only time will tell as to whether it was a good move or a bad move. But as of right now, people who I think understand the story accept it. They go, yep, it's all done and dusty. You get to a certain point and you finish. And other people are going to be going, okay, I feel like we've just like stopped in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, we'll cover that off as we get further along. Now, we're actually a couple of things I've got to mention here. We are joined actually by a number one American fan, good old Floyd. Good to see you over there. It's 3 a.m. where he is. Good old William. He's definitely not a Dune fan. So sorry, William, you're going to be bored tonight. You might as well just tune out and watch the cricket. So there you go. And I like this one from Aaron. Yes, they all walked in the desert and lived happily ever after. And we'll get around to that as we go along. So our aim is to sort of cover the film in two aspects. One is the positives and the concerns. We're not saying negatives. We're just looking at potential things worthy of discussion. So we don't want to sit there and pick nits out of it, but there are some things that you go, you know what, if you know the story well enough, you could look at some areas and go, oh, okay, that's interesting that they took this path, which may or may not be a smart move, but you know, in the end, it's all kind of cool. For myself, it was actually very, very impressive by a long shot. Had some beautiful, I do have some pictures, by the way, some beautiful vistas, and I got to admit, in terms of the world building, there was definitely, that's what modern filmmaking can do. It can make things absolutely magnificent to look at. And I got to say, I was very impressed because ultimately it is hardcore science fiction. It is not a kid's movie. It's not like intended to be like fun or humorous or anything like that. It is very, very intense stuff. So, and as we, I think, discussed once before, if you went into it thinking it was going to be like a Marvel Cinematic Universe, oh, this is going to be awesome. You know, there's heroes everywhere and bad guys over here and like the good guys come out triumphant and all the rest of it. It's not like that at all. It's completely intense. And I was really impressed with the fact that they stuck with that and didn't try to humorize it in any way, shape or form, because it's very, very intense. It's a very depressing existence that everybody's living in. And there's just no room for any sort of humor and fun. So I think that was actually very, very important. So I agree with you, Colin. I was surprised that Claire hasn't read the book. I was very surprised. I only found this out yesterday, and I was really surprised by that. So, that's actually quite cool. Yeah, just quickly, any particular reason why you didn't get around to reading the book?
No, I mean, I have it on my shelf. I even have the original in the magazine series how it was originally published. But there've just always been other things I was more interested in at the time, so it hasn't happened. That's all. No particular reason. Although, to be honest, the 80s movie might have had something to do with it. I wasn't enamored of the 80s movie. I was always a bit ambivalent about that. And I think that probably affected my desire to read the book. I think that probably is part of the reason why I haven't read it. Just didn't grab me.
That's interesting because it was the opposite for me. It was because of the movie I read the book, and that's why when I watched the movie, just everything clicked, and I thought, oh my god, this is one of the greatest things ever. The only thing that that movie suffered from was the fact that it was made in the 80s, and it couldn't. If it was made again today, modernized in a lot of ways, it would be just outstanding. But anyway, we're not here to discuss that, which is very, very cool. So yes, good old Floyd saying yes, he is actually here, which is very, very groovy. You mentioned about the casting. One of the things that I did actually like is the fact that they had, I can't pronounce the actor's name. It's some unusual sort of, do you know how it's pronounced? Timothy, like Timothy.
I don't know his name. I don't know his name.
One thing I did like about his casting is the fact that for the most part, aside from this sequence here, his hair was a mess. And I really liked that. That was the one thing that they sort of cocked up with the 84 movie where Kyle MacLachlan's hair was always perfect. Whereas in this, it actually is a bit of a mess and he's a bit of a scruffy dude. And that kind of works. And it's interesting because the actor's like in his early 20s, whereas Paul in the story is only meant to be like 14. So, but I guess if you use the real 14-year-old, it probably wouldn't have worked. And I guess this guy looks young enough to be like a mid-teenager, even though he's not. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. He was great in this role, and casting it with someone who looked so young and behaved in a young fashion too. Like he was, running up and hugging his mates and stuff like that, which I think really worked well. Like it said a lot about the character, and it made the shift in the character much more believable and much more obvious as well. I really liked him. I thought he did a great job. And the hair thing, there was one scene where I was looking at it thinking, dude, get your hair out of your eyes. How can you do that with your hair in your eyes all the time? But it made it look, as you say, it made it more realistic. It made it, he was out in the desert or whatever, and he was, he didn't have access to all the moose or whatever that Kyle obviously had when he was doing it. So I really liked him. I thought it was a good casting choice, having someone not necessarily actually young, but someone who looked and behaved much younger, worked really well, I think.
Yep, totally agree. I thought this was kind of interesting, right? So you got Oscar Isaacs playing Duke Leto, and I thought that worked out great. He was fine. There was no problems there. And of course, there's a few comments going on here regarding spice and Star Wars, and like Aaron said, it's on Kessel and all that sort of stuff. And of course, there's the ultimate gag in this movie where his character says, "Oh, I always wanted to be a pilot." Right, and of course, Oscar Isaacs in the Star Wars series is like the greatest pilot in the universe. How's that for? I don't know if that was intentional or not, or whether they just chucked that line in because he was, Poe Dameron from the Force Awakens. But I thought that was just a cute little gag. So yes, well done. So there you go. Gavin has asked, you may not have read the book, but did you read the back cover? I'm not entirely sure why he's asking that.
I'm sure I did. I'm sure I read the back cover before I bought the book, but I don't remember it. It's been on my shelves for years. Like I've had it for years and years and years and just never read it. So I probably did read the back at one stage. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we were saying about the visual side, so I saw the movie in the cinemas and in VMAX, and I got to say the visual effects side, that sort of, I mean, we always knew that was going to be a huge winner. There was going to be very few things that they could screw up regarding that. And even the audio side was absolutely outstanding. Where I heard it was just magnificent. So that alone really immerses you into the world, and I was very, very impressed with that. And of course, in terms of the some of the styling and the design, one of the things that really pushed my buttons, if I find a bloody picture of the damn thing, was actually the ornithopters. And you think I could find the picture? I can't. So because they were based on how the book was, where they had the flapping wings, and so some of the designs regarding the ships was fantastic. So what do you reckon on that?
Yeah. They look like dragonflies, and it's an unusual method of flight, but it worked really well, and they just looked gorgeous. They just, when they were flying around, the shots, especially the shots when you sort of see them from above, it just looks like dragonflies, and I thought they were just gorgeous. I thought they were really good. Yeah.
In terms of other ship designs, I thought was very intriguing because a lot of people like focus on hardware and they like their spaceships depending on they're big, small, and whatever. And I'm going to admit, this one I found was interesting. So this was actually, I don't know what you would call this, the Emperor's Envoy or whatever else. And I thought that's an unusual design. There's like, how would you describe that? It's like, I don't know. What do you think? That was just something completely left field.
Yeah, well, it made me think of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There, in the movie version of that, there's little round bubble type ships. But even watching the way it worked, like when the feet kind of started popping out, I was kind of looking at it going, "Oh, how's that going to work?" But then it did; it all fitted together. So yeah, it was an interesting design, that one. But it fitted with the bigger ships that they had, that had the big round gapy mouth that they all came out of as well. There was lots of round, So there was lots of that oval and circular design in the Emperor's sort of ships, and it was an interesting one, that one. I noticed it particularly just because of the way it landed and the way the feet worked and all that kind of stuff.
So this is a Guild Highliner. And sorry, what was that?
No, go on.
So this was a Guild Highliner, and it was very interesting that in this particular version of the film, they didn't show the Spacing Guild at all. They referenced them, obviously, and it was quite interesting. But they've gone for the long cylindrical look again, which was very similar to what they did in the 84 movie as well. So clearly that's obviously designed after how they were referenced in the book, which makes a lot of sense. So, but to go for that particular style rather than putting a whole lot of blinking lights and things all over it, which is very, very common in science fiction movies, was really, really groovy. So did very, very well. I like the idea that they actually showed a bit of the history of Duke Leto's parents, like the Paul, I think it was Paulus Atreides, I think, the previous Duke who had the bullfighting and all that sort of business, and that's actually from the earlier books. So the fact that they had the statue and all the rest of it, I thought that was a really nice sort of like bit of a backstory they had added in, along with all the tombstones and all the rest of it. So they've tried to really show that yes, there is actually a big long family history with the Atreides, and how Paul fits into that. And I actually thought that actually worked really, really well. What do you reckon?
Yeah, the imagery that went along with that was really interesting because it was very, very human. It was the Scottish Highlands. It was the bagpipes. It was the bullfighting. It was all these things that, that we sort of see as human, and then opposed to that, and nature. Like they were outside on Caladan there were, there's grass and trees and that kind of stuff. And then the way that was contrasted with the Harkonnen environment, the homeworld there, and the Harkonnen people, it made them look much more alien. It made the Atreides look so human that by comparison, the Harkonnens were kind of even more alien than they already were. I mean, I know they're, but it made them look and feel quite different. And the contrast between I thought of it as the Scottish Highlands, because that's what it felt like to me, that the outdoors, natural, that kind of stuff, compared with the full-on industrial aesthetic on the Harkonnen homeworld, made it really interesting. Like it really kind of set out the difference between the two houses, which I thought worked really well. Yeah.
Good stuff. Now, this is something, there's a question here from ads I'm going to bring up in a second, but this is something I really did like, and I think this was referenced from the book as well, about the palm trees. And of course, the idea, and this is probably if there's a weak aspect of the story, it was a little bit like how water is precious on Arrakis. Now, they do reference the fact that as the guy's watering the plants, that he said this could feed, was it five people per day or something like that, per plant or something along those lines. But the fact that they actually showed this, I thought it worked really, really well. It's the really interesting contrast of the palm trees versus all this sandstone monolithic structures, and that once again, of course, from an imagery point of view, was absolutely outstanding. And when I saw this, I thought, this actually very, very cool that they've done this, and it was really, really groovy. What do you reckon?
It also pointed out, like Paul's reaction to it, also kind of pointed out his moral compass. I think, like he was questioning whether we should have these if it's if we're taking water away from people, aren't people more important? So I think that also helped show up his character quite strongly, which was a really interesting way of doing it.
Sorry, go on.
Just those few trees and nothing else on the planet was, it was very interesting. And very visually in your face, like really kind of, you see the trees and you're like, wait, what? I thought that worked brilliantly.
Yeah, exactly right. It reminds me, if you remember the Foundation series where Trantor was all a big city, but there was where the Emperor lived, it was all gardens. So similar principle. The exclusive elitist sort of look and feel. Ads has asked about, did you like the way they used the little projector instead of the opening monologue? That's obviously, it's called a film book. And what I found interesting is, and I'll get to you in a second, is that I like the idea of it, but regardless of how you try to avoid it, you've still got to have exposition. You've still got to explain what the plant, what Arrakis is, what this is, what that is. You can't avoid it. Right? Someone has to explain it to the audience. Otherwise, they'll be going, I've got no idea what's going on. But the way they did it here, instead of just dumping it all in your face at the very beginning and drip feeding it all the way through, I think worked a lot better. Because I was thinking from the point of view of the audience, thinking, all right, they're going to have to absorb what's being said here. Otherwise, they're going to have no idea what's going on. But I thought the way they did it was very clever. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. That not having just voiceovers all the time, having it actually integrated into the story worked really well. And again, it showed up a bit of Paul's character. Like he was learning, he was interested, he found out where they were going and he wanted to know more about it. He wasn't just sort of some spoiled kid who was, we already know he kind of doesn't want to be in charge, but he's also taking it seriously. And the little, I can't remember what it was called, but the little animal that he saw in that projection.
It's actually, the mouse is actually called the Morgib.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. So that bringing that into it at that point, without even really explaining it, brings it up. Yeah, exactly. It just kind of gives you those little hints ahead of time about what might happen and about how important something like that's going to be. Yeah, I loved the way they did it. I thought that even some of the people asking questions and getting answers was a better way of doing it than just voiceovers. I thought it was really well integrated into the story all the way through.
Yeah, the idea the more did, the mouse was ingenious because you got this really, really desolate world and this tiny thing which can still survive, which is really, really cool. Works. And the fact you did get to see it up close and how it lives and it secretes water from its ears and all sort of business, absolutely fantastic. Thomas has asked about a computer game called Predator, Warcraft, and Command & Conquer. It was called Dune 2. Okay, and he used the Command & Conquer engine. I just sort of chucked that in because I used to play it, so which is very, very cool. Aaron has asked, you're a bit disappointed there wasn't more time on Dune before the Harkonnens invaded again and the Fremen realizing the Duke wasn't as bad as the Baron was. Yeah, I guess that was a bit of a timing thing. I think in the books it's actually a longer period of time, whereas in the movie they've just landed and the next day the Harkonnens re-attack and all the rest of it. I guess part of the narrative, you just got to move on with the story, and that's just the way it goes. Aaron has also said the Lynch version had so much exposition. The exposition actually, so I forgot to mention phase back in. Yeah, well, that's right. So we're not covering the 84 movie. That was obviously an issue that they had trying to get it all out in the open very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So on things that we're still focusing on the positives, I did like the way they dealt with the spice miners because we actually see them physically move around, which I thought was kind of groovy, and the idea with the carry-all and all the rest of it. So, but yeah, being low sort of crafted machines and all the dust plumes and all the rest of it, that I actually think from a visual perspective, worked really well. And of course, once you get to Arrakis and everything's got that yellowish, dull tinge to it, you really can say that, yeah, this is a very, very harsh planet to be on. And even whenever you saw a blue sky, the skies were never really, really blue. That's just the nature of the harsh environment. And I think that actually worked quite well. What do you reckon?
Yeah, no, I agree. The way it was portrayed visually was great.
Yeah. I thought it was. I can't remember how they described the carry-alls in the books as to whether they have the balloons on the top and all the rest of it. So, because it was a very interesting sort of stylish design and how they hook onto the miners themselves and lift them off the surface. So, for those who wouldn't know, because the spice miners are pumping out the rhythmic sort of vibrations, the worms would just be doing laps backwards and forwards. So just go past, drop the miner down, the thing would do a U-turn and come back, and they just lift it up again. It would just be an all-time happening thing. So. Yeah, and even Ads has said, it was an interesting sort of, I think it's an interesting idea. So, yeah, very, very cool. So, and we've already bored William. Sorry, dude. Yeah. So, well, that's exactly right. Now, that's just the nature of the beast. But you've got to remember, the key thing is that, Dune is a pretty serious piece of work in terms of a science fiction movie, and it's not going to appeal to everybody. And that's why I thought it'd be very intriguing to see people who have never read the book and never seen any of the previous iterations, whether they're going to understand as to what's going on or whether it's still going to confuse them. And I thought what worked is that they removed certain aspects of the characterization. So they didn't include the Spacing Guild, so you didn't have to worry about those guys. The Bene Gesserit was only just touched on just briefly. So you actually reduced your character count to try and make things a bit more simpler. Yeah. And that worked in some areas and didn't work in others. But I think by and large, people got the story clicked in pretty easily. So what do you reckon, eh? So, I like this from Gavin.
No, I agree.
Up for William. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, I agree. I think leaving out things like the Space Guild worked really well because, as you say, it kind of simplified the plot a little bit. It made it easier for people to understand. And it also, you could fit more of the story into that period, into a single movie or half a movie, I guess. It worked for me.
Yeah, cool. And what I really liked is you got to see more of Arrakeen. Even in the 84 movie, it was barely touched on. So there's actually cities living on Arrakis, and Arrakeen is the capital city. And you got to see the population of the people who live there, because you sort of forget that there are people there, and they're not all Fremen either. So these are people who just sort of live there and work there. And you can't imagine a more harsh environment to live on when you sit and think about it. But I was really impressed by seeing this, and I thought, that works for me in a big way. And of course, you have all the population who live there as well, and of course, they all think that Paul is the new Messiah. So that was nice to have that all covered off. I thought that worked quite well, actually. What do you reckon?
Yep. No, I agree completely. The city was great. Like, it fitted the world too. It wasn't. Every now and then in science fiction movies, you get cities that just don't look as though they would be on that world. And you kind of wonder, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense on this world. But in this case, it really worked well. It fitted. It was the color of it was the sand. It was covered in sand. It was built out of sandstone. It was all, massive, heavy, solid things to keep it safe from the weather, but also from these huge, giant worms. You would have to build it like that. There'd be no other way to do it. Yeah.
Because it was
the thing
really
to remember,
they did touch up. Sorry, did I cut you off? No. No. So the key thing for a lot of people to remember who don't know the story that well is that obviously the spice is based on Arrakis, and it is necessary for everything. Okay, so it's not just a narcotic; it's used for transportation. It's used as the all throughout the Imperium. It is like almost like the basis of all their currency, and it can't be manufactured. It can only be mined. So whoever has access to the spice really has all the power. And there's this entire political backstory that deals with all the economic factions regarding how the spice is used and traded and all the rest of it, and that's where the power comes from. So the Spacing Guild, for example, need it for their space travel. Everybody else uses it purely for their economic sort of currency, and because you can't manufacture it, it has to be mined. That gives it's a fascinating concept that you sort of have to realize how the universe works in this particular place, and it's equivalent to oil on Earth. But imagine you can only get oil from one place, and it's almost as along those lines. So, yeah, very, very cool. use the thick and shakes at McDonald's. Yeah, I love that. Absolutely love it. So, yeah, very, very groovy. And in terms of other things that I thought worked out well, so the idea of like when Paul fights off against Jamis, and of course the whole idea of that is that Paul has to grow up, and he has to grow up pretty damn quickly. So he's been living a sheltered life in Caldan. Sure, he's gone through all the training with Duncan, Idaho, and all the rest of it, but now suddenly he's thrust into a real environment. And that I think was a really good sequence because he hadn't killed anybody before, and of course, ironically, after this, he's going to be killing shitloads of dudes. But that I thought was a really, really telling moment. And of course, Jamis being a trained Fremen warrior, wouldn't know what he would be dealing with regarding Paul. So I thought was a very, very good sequence. What do you reckon? Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was the whole awakening thing. It was. His mother made the point that he'd never killed anyone before. That's why he was hesitating. That's why he wasn't doing it, and that was what tipped him over into adulthood, really.
Yeah. Very cool. So Gavin has mentioned there's a meth lab somewhere working on it. Actually, no, they've tried, and in the books it's covered off that everybody's trying to make artificial versions of the spice, and it just isn't physically possible. It just doesn't work, and that's the reason why the spice from Arrakis is so important to everybody. So, yeah, it was really, really, really cool. So I guess now that we're sort of halfway through the discussion, we can actually look at some of the concerns, some of the things that sort of like didn't work or are questionable in many ways. And there were a couple of things that I thought were intriguing. It's like one of the key ones is the absence of Fade Ralpha. So who's the brother of Raban and also the nephew of the Baron. And he's just not even in the film at all. Now, I understand he's appearing in the second movie. And because the idea is, for those who don't know, the idea being that Raban has been given control of Arrakis to really, really brutalize all the people who work there, with the idea being that the Baron will bring Fade in to take over, and Fade will be seen as like a savior to all the people, and he'll be loved by everybody. But of course, Fade isn't introduced in this film at all. Now, apparently he's appearing in the second movie, but then I don't know if it'll be too late or not, because that's part of the whole machinations that's going on behind the scenes. And that was an example, I think, okay, one character too many, we'll just drop Fade out of the picture. But he's actually quite integral to the story to a large degree. So did you even like notice that, or even aware of that at all?
I mean, I was vaguely aware of it. When I watched the 80s movie, I watched it because Sting was in it. So that was my reason for watching it. But no, it didn't particularly get my attention, to be honest, at all. The story so far anyway made sense without him. So I didn't kind of notice that he was missing.
Yeah, no, that's fair. You're right. You don't notice it at all, and that's fair enough too. But I thought there was an interesting sort of absence. A couple of people I thought kind of got jibbed quite badly in terms of their characterizations. So you had the Shadow Mapes in this sequence, and she only appears in 3 scenes, and it's almost like her presence was almost unnecessary to a large degree because she didn't get to do anything. And of course, when you see her assassinated on the steps, that when Leto goes over to her, it's like it could have been anybody really, and she actually had a bigger role in the 84 movie because she was actually part of the Fremen. And of course, she has the knife. And the interesting thing, I don't know if you picked up on this, but I always pronounce Chris knife, but it's Christ knife. When you pull it out of the sheath, you're supposed to put blood on it before you put it back into the sheath. And of course, in this, they didn't do that. And I thought that was an interesting sort of omission. But anyway, what do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, again, I sort of wasn't particularly aware of the significance in the other movie, but it didn't. The whole bit about her being killed on the steps kind of didn't particularly work well because she wasn't significant enough at that point for it to be such a big thing. So that scene kind of didn't work particularly well for me, just because, you know, you didn't really have any sense of how important she was at all at that stage.
Yep. And the other character I thought who really got jibbed quite badly in terms of his screen presence and time was poor old Dr. Yui. So, and this is one example I really do stand on the view that the 84 version treated Yui with a lot more respect. So the idea is that Dr. Yui is a Suk doctor, S-U-K doctor, right? And he's got the Imperial conditioning on the forehead there. And of course, they had to break the Imperial conditioning to get him to betray the Atreides by capturing his wife, who's a Bene Gesserit. And I felt this was kind of really skirted over very, very swiftly in this particular story, because there's no history of like this version of Yui really disliking the Harkonnens. They sort of just bypass it altogether, and he just seems to portray the Atreides with very little justification. And I thought if there's a weak part of the story, it's almost like this is it, because he just like works against them, and there doesn't seem to be a good reason for it. Did you pick up on that at all?
Well, they did have his wife. They were torturing his wife. I thought that was enough of a reason, to be honest. It didn't occur to me that wasn't enough of a reason. I didn't. I mean, I'm kind of aware that there was the conditioning and all that kind of stuff, but it wasn't played up enough in this to make much difference. But the fact that they had his wife and that he was trying to save her, he clearly loved her very much and wanted to end her suffering. I thought that was enough of a reason.
No, that's fair enough. So yeah, I also thought the blue in the blue eyes, I can admit, need to be bluer. What do you reckon? It's a small thing, but I thought I really wanted them just like really stand out and really pop. But exactly right.
I know, I agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, needed to be a bit more intense. So some people have been very critical of the fact that Paul Chani didn't have a lot to do in the film, and I guess in the second movie she'll have a lot more to say or do, which is kind of groovy. And what's interesting is, I don't know if people are aware of this or not. It's very, very subtle, but it is actually in the books. So her father was actually, if I can find the right picture, Laird Kynes, who was the planetologist, the Emperor's hand thing, right? And of course, they've changed the gender of Laird Kynes from male to female. You know, they've done it purely for a diversity level. That's fine. But if they're keeping that same link, that means that this Kynes is actually the mother of Chani. And I'd be curious to see whether they sort of keep that in the story or not, whether they even reference it in the story or not. They did it very subtly in the 84 movie, where Chani says, "I'm Chani, the daughter of Liet." And of course, Liet is Kynes, which is the Max von Sydow character. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of change. So, I mean, it certainly could be the mother of Chani. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it'd be curious to see if anybody sort of put two and two together on that one. What do you reckon?
Oh, I had no idea. That wasn't on my radar at all.
Yeah.
So, interesting.
No, that's all right. Where are we? No, you would have to think the Bene Gesserit would have. Angela said, "The world you thought the Bene Gesserit would save this." So, well, it all depends. So it's, I don't know. I can't remember. I actually haven't read the original books for a very, very long time, so I actually don't remember how it all played out. So I thought it was interesting, regarding just getting back to Arrakis, that they didn't actually mention that there's no rain. The idea is it never rained on Arrakis at all. I know they said it was a desert planet and all the rest of it. And of course, the irony being that if it does rain, it kills all the worms, because the worms don't like water. And even Ange back up here, it's made a mention about how the little makers, which is like the small worms, produce the water of life. And even the water of life wasn't referenced at all in this, which I thought was really interesting, because the water of life is what the Bene Gesserit take to sort of like become this big, powerful super thing. And only women can take the water of life. Men can't. And all that was just completely missed. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. They've just, once again, it's probably so much information. They've just said, you know what, let's just keep it simple and just not even bother including it, maybe save it for the second film. So is that something you picked up on at all?
I did, actually, because Paul's awakening happens through the water of life. And in this movie, that wasn't at all what happened. His kind of awakening was that moment where he first killed a man. That was how I read it, how I interpreted it. So that was quite a big change, I thought. I mean, I thought it worked. I thought the way they did it worked, but it didn't have the impact that the Water of Life would have, and it reduces the connection he has with the Bene Gesserit as well, I think. And I'm not sure how that'll play out in the next movie. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, it was quite a different way of him sort of coming to that awakening. Yeah.
I'd be curious to see how people sort of interpret the Kwisatz Haderach thing. So even though a lot of people really had a lot of issues with the 84 movie, they did try and cover off a lot of this stuff. And at the start, when Paul's talking to Helen Mahim, she explains the whole thing of the Water of Life, the Kwisatz Haderach, the whole bit done. Okay, we're cool. We know what's going on now. In this, I kind of skirted over that as well. So the Kwisatz Haderach is a bit of a big deal, really, in the scheme of things. And I don't know if that really came across in this particular story, because once again, it's like, oh my God, there's just too much to absorb. And why Paul is the Messiah, because he's meant to be the Kwisatz Haderach. And so did you find that was to be the case at all?
I think they kind of swapped it out. I mean, the Kwisatz Haderach wasn't as necessary because of the way they showed everyone believing him to be the Messiah. I don't think it matters which way you come at it, whether it's the Messiah or whether it's because it's the same thing in the end. So I think it came across well enough that he was going to be, this hugely important person, whether he wanted it or not. The actual name and how he gets there obviously is going to be a bit different, I guess.
Yeah. Ads has asked whether you'll now read the book now that you've seen the movie. I'm assuming the answer is no, because you've already, you know the story well enough. But
well, I mean, I've been thinking. I have actually thought about it since I saw the movie. But there are so many other books that I want to read more. So I might one day, but not anytime soon.
So Ads mentioned about the Water of Life being covered in the second movie. If you're going to do that, there's a lot to cover off in the second movie. So you got to introduce Fate, as we said. You got to then clear up the Kwisatz Haderach. You got to introduce the Water of Life, and it's like a massive dump of just information that's just going to get plonked onto people's heads, and they go, oh my God, it's almost like they have to over exposize, if that's such a word, the second film just as much as the first film, because there's a lot to sort of remember and take on board. You haven't even got to the thing of riding the worms yet and all the rest of it, how that works. And goodness gracious me. One of the things that I was very critical of, and I thought did not work as well as it should have, was the sequence, if I can find the picture, where is this, I thought was very disappointing, is the hand in the box sequence, right? So the problem I had with this, he put the hand in the box. What's in the box? Pain, right? And he's moaning and groaning and carrying on. And for the most part, aside from one brief shot, you have no idea what's going on. So and this is one thing I thought the 84 movie had down pat. They actually show what's happened to his hand. There's all this fire burning to his hand. He's actually copping it pretty bad, right? In this, it's almost like they're afraid to show it. Aside from, they had all these flashing moments. They had one bit where his hand is really, really badly damaged. I get that. But it wasn't a build-up. And I thought, we're missing a moment here. We actually need to see what he thinks is actually happening to his hand, which didn't actually happen at all. Did you pick up on that at all?
Oh, I did, and I disagree. I think the acting in that scene covered it. I think his reactions, his face, the way he behaved, showed you enough of what you needed to know. I actually thought that scene worked really well, and I thought it worked better than the 80s movie. But I mean, maybe that's just me, but I thought his reactions were sufficient, more than enough. But I will note, on that note, that a lot of this movie felt like it had been sanitized in a lot of ways. It wasn't as just plain icky in some places, like the Baron particularly. That was always one of the things that kind of makes your stomach churn. And not just the way he looked, but his behavior in certain ways. And none of that was in this movie. And I think there are a few places where they've done that, and I think this is one of them. I think this particular one worked because I think his acting made it work. I think his reactions and his sound and that kind of stuff, I think that made it work. But I think that's what they've done in a lot of places. I think they've kind of sanitized it, maybe for a modern audience. I don't know. And I think the movie lost out a little bit because of that.
I agree with you completely. I found the issue, like with the Beast Raban, is effectively he wasn't beastly enough. And sure, he like lops the heads off of a few dudes, but
Yeah.
it's more suggested than shown, and it really needed to be shown. And I felt, and I agree with you. I thought, well, it's working, but it just comes across as like, okay, we just got another a bad dude, as it were. And it's the
Yeah.
impact. I think I agree with, even with the Baron. I totally agree. Just kind of wasn't there. The threat wasn't there, and it's meant to be dark and icky and really off-putting because that's the nature of the environment that
Yeah.
they live in. And Gigi Prime, where they live, is a very, very unhappy place, and it is black and
Yeah.
it's horrible. And you're right. I think
Full
they
on
skirted
industrial.
over that issue for whatever reason, and they needed to really, really push that a bit further. So, particularly like we
Yeah.
mentioned the '84 movie, there's some really off scenes in that, and you go, yeah, when Raban's pulled the tongue out of the dead cow and he's eating it, and the Baron's doing it, like, that's pretty off. But it's meant to be off. It's meant to be like, oh my god,
Exactly.
that's really gross,
Yeah.
right? And the
Yeah.
whole thing, and I thought maybe they've gone the PC route with this too, because the Baron is homosexual. And the sequence in the '84 movie where he pulls the heart plug out of the dude and all that, and you're meant to be turned off by that, and you go, oh, that's just really off.
Yeah.
Whereas in this, there's very, very little of that at all. I
There's
thought,
no
yeah,
indication.
yeah, I think you're right. I think they've played it safe, and I think that's probably a bit of a letdown because you really want to think, oh, mate, this guy's an asshole. We really, really want him gone. But yeah, that's a very good observation, actually.
Yeah. I mean, he's pretty bad. He is still pretty bad, and you do still kind of want him gone. You know, he's not going to be a good boss, basically. But yeah, I just think it was a little bit. It was interesting because I came out of the movie and all I could think was, wow, that was beautiful. Like, it just looked stunning pretty much all the way through. And then I started thinking, but there were bits of it that shouldn't have been beautiful. There were bits of it that should have been much uglier and more, I don't know what the word is, but gritty. That's the word. You know, that kind of stuff. That all of that was missing, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. As mentioned, attempt to sanitize or streamline. I agree with Claire. I think it is the sanitization thing because, yeah, they could have pushed the boundaries if they wanted to. And for whatever reason, they chose not to. And I think maybe it was they didn't want to turn their audience off. So if the idea being that if you have sequences that are really quite, not to use icky, but really off-putting, people won't go back and watch the film. So you go, you know what, play it safe. Still gets the point across for the most part. And people will go back and watch the movie again, because that was something that happened in the '84 movie. People did think, oh, this is kind of gross, and that may have turned them off. So
I was one of those.
And yet absolutely it worked as well. So exactly right. We just discussed that, Aaron, about the dead cow and pulling the tongue out, and they actually and Paul Smith, the actor, actually did that for real. So there you go. Another thing I thought. It was done for. It was actually his idea, and so another thing I thought was kind of not really covered off was about Thufir Hawat and the Mentats. So once again, in the '84 movie, they cover off what the Mentats are. They're human computers. They take the juice of Safu, gives them the red lips. There you go. And in this, I thought they skirted past that. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people thought, well, who's this guy? And of course, you don't know what happens to him. Maybe they'll cover that off in the second movie as well. But it was kind of like, okay, the attack on Arakeens occurred. All these people are subtly missing. Where are they all? And of course, it's very significant because he gets captured by the Harkonnens. But I felt the whole thing with the Mentats wasn't really covered off that well. It's like, okay, we've got this dude. Who is he? Where's he from? And why is he so important? And I thought that was kind of skirted over as well, probably to save time on characterization. So, because obviously the Harkonnens have Piter de Vries, and it wasn't. I didn't think it was made clear as to who these dudes were meant to be. So, I don't know if you felt the same way or not, but yeah.
I mean, the human computer thing came across really clearly. I thought the way there were just enough sort of references to that and uses of it to make that clear, but how and why and where they came from, none of that really came into it. And certainly the part he played was pretty minimal.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And it's kind of funny. One thing that this film did have, it was exactly the same problem, and we've discussed this just very, very briefly in other episodes, is that with the still suits, okay? And the still suits, based on the books, you're meant to have the whole head covered. And they can't do that because if you cover the whole head, you can't see who's who in the zoo, and you don't know who anybody is. So you got to do the old nose plug thing. In this case, they put the thing over the face, which is fine, but you lose all this moisture from up here. You know, don't worry about it; it's all good. And I thought, what do you do? I mean, you can't get around that problem. And ironically, the '84 movie had exactly the same issue. So, I thought that was kind of amusing. Very,
I mean,
the
only sort of thing you could do would be to find a way to personalize the still suits, like they did in, I can't even remember which Star Wars movie it was, where he ended up with the red stripes on his helmet, so you couldn't see his face, but you knew it was him because of this red stripe thing. But you don't get any of the emotion across. You don't get any of that. All that becomes a lot harder. So yeah, I think that's one of the kinds of sacrifices that you kind of have to make for a visual medium. Like in a book, it's easy to do. It's easy to describe. It's easy to tell people who's talking and who's walking and who's fighting who. But in a movie, you've got to be able to see it, or it just doesn't work. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame, because it does kind of. I think you're right. It takes away from it a little bit. It makes it just a little bit less believable that they could survive in the desert in that way. But you kind of have to make these compromises to make a movie, I guess.
Yeah, totally agree. And I did find that like some of the the still suits like had armor on them. I thought that kind of didn't work for me, but it's just aesthetics. It really doesesome matter. One thing I did like is you got to see a bit more of the Sardaukar. I actually got to see Seleucus Secundus, which I thought was kind of groovy. So for those who didn't ever put two and two together, the Sardaukar are based on Seleucus Secundus, which is a really, really hospitable planet. And that's the reason why they're such good fighters, because they're bred in and trained in an environment which is really nasty. But of course, the Fremen are also training in an environment which is really nasty. And so hence the reason why they're sort of equal on equal terms in a lot of ways. And the sequences with Duncan Idaho fighting the Sardaukar and killing them all, that was quite good. That worked out really, really well. But once again, they followed the same problem that the 84 movie had, because in the book, the Sardaukar are actually wearing Harkonnen uniforms because they don't want everybody to find out that the Emperor is involved in the takeover. If you do that, then the Landsraad turns against the Emperor, going, "Oi, you're showing favoritism between these sides." But of course, from the narrative point of view, you need to see who's who in the zoo. So the Sardaukar are wearing white, the Harkonnens are wearing black, and it looks grouse. It's fantastic. But the funny thing is, that's not how it's meant to be. And even in this story, someone says, "I've got to run off and tell the Emperor what's going on." Tell the Landsraad, "Oh yeah, the Emperor is like helping the Harkonnens." And of course, no one's supposed to know. It's meant to be this top secret thing. So, but I guess for the nature of the story, you just had to just say, you know what, just push that aside for now and just go, it looked good, it worked well, and it was kind of groovy. So, what do you reckon?
Yeah. No, I agree completely. It did look good and it did work well, but it was a little bit like, wait, shouldn't they be at least pretending that they're not the Emperor?
yeah, exactly right.
It was just kind of, hi, here we are. I was like,
Yep, totally.
So yeah, there were a couple things like
that. Good stuff. I'm just going through my bits and pieces. I've got all my notes here. Where are we? Shut up. Oh, good on, bloody hell. I haven't spoken about Jessica yet at all. So the portrayal of Lady Jessica, I thought it was a shame she didn't look more regal, because the Francesca Annis version from Dune was the 84 movie was just absolutely stunning. But I guess for this particular story, it still worked just as well. Any thoughts on Jessica in this?
Well, it was interesting because I didn't realise that she wasn't his wife, for one thing. No. And I think her being less regal made that more obvious and worked well. She's a concubine. She's not his wife. So I think that worked. I really liked her portrayal of Jessica. I really liked the conflict between her as a mother and her as a Bene Gesserit. I thought that was really good. She's trying to figure out, she loves her son and wants him to be okay, but also wants him to be important and as good as he can be and all that kind of stuff. But she's also torn by, and her love for the Duke. And then the instructions that she's being given by the Bene Gesserit, which are completely the opposite from what she wants. And I think she did that really well. I think the mother-son relationship between the two of them was really good. There's one scene where they're escaping, and she's getting him to use the voice and trying to get him to do it properly. And they're in the middle of an escape, and she turns around and says to him, "Your pitch was too forced." And I'm just like, that's such a mother thing to do. And such a trainer thing to do. You're in the middle of trying to get away from all these bad guys and you have to go now because otherwise you're going to die, but your pitch was too forced. You could do better. I loved that. I really liked the way they did that. The relationship between them worked really well. She clearly loved him and wanted what was best for him all the way through.
So for those who didn't know, and this is actually in the story, so as was mentioned, Jessica was supposed to give birth to a daughter. We'll call it, for the sake of the argument, Paula, not Paul, but Paula, right? And of course, the idea was to produce the Kwisatz Haderach. Paul Art was supposed to hook up with Fade Routher, and their offspring, which would be a female, would be the Kwisatz Haderach. So they just missed it by one generation. So there you go. I thought it was interesting. There's no reference at all to the Weeding Way, right? So now in the 84 movie, the Weeding Way was a weapon. Okay, it was ammunition for a gun. In the original story, it was a fighting style used by the Fremen. And they just like cleared in this film. They said, you know what? It's too hard, too complicated. Let's just ditch it all together. So the Weeding Way doesn't happen at all. And I think, you know what? It kind of works. You don't need it. It's all kind of groovy. But it was amusing when they made a real focal point of saying you got to walk without rhythm in the desert, right? You got to, you sort of walk us the Fremen way and all sort of business. And that was really groovy. But when they have to run up a hill, they just run up a hill. And it's like, hang on, you've just thrown away all that knowledge out the window.
Yeah, but even the first time he went out there, he wasn't walking without rhythm. He knew he should be, and he didn't to begin with. That kind of bugged me a little bit because I was like, he's supposed to, he's actually, this is something he already knows. It's something that, we've been told, we've been shown that he knows this, and he should have paid attention because he's supposed to be this amazing person, and yet he just kind of walks out into the desert. And I'm like, no, he knows better than that. He should have done better than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, once they start running, it's all out the window. They just run, which you kind of can't blame them for. It's kind of at that point, it's too late to worry about it.
Yeah. I mean, because cinematically, it would look stupid. Okay, we're going to run up a hill, but we're going to do it the Fremen way, and it would look and be hard to do because the idea of the Fremen, they've trained it into their mind. They've been at it since they've been little kids, right? Whereas if you're just learning for the first time and you need to get somewhere in a hurry, clearly it's going to be very difficult to master. And cinematically, it would look pretty stupid. So they're sort of always like, let's just forget about it. Just run up a hill. So you run up a hill, and then a word comes and eats you, and away you go. So, I got to laugh.
And running in the sand is hard enough anyway.
Yeah, totally agree. Now, Andrew's asked a good question. Did Gurney Halleck bring his guitar, which is called a basilic? I think it's what it's called. I didn't see that mentioned or referenced at all. Ironically, it was actually referenced in the 84 movie because he actually no music. We're unpacking this for the crossing. So, because he does play music.
There was a mention of music.
Yeah, I don't recall that being brought up at all. So,
it was definitely mentioned.
Was it? Okay, cool. So the Ministry of
the music was definitely mentioned.
Good stuff. And I thought it was interesting they had bagpipes. I go, oh, okay. When they first land on Arrakis.
Yeah, I love that.
Oh, bagpipes. I don't know where that one came from, but whatever works is all kind of groovy.
I mean, it worked for me because it tied in with that Scottish landscape that they had on Caladan. Like, if you watch when you see there's that whole sequence where, I mean, you were talking about it before, the history, his father and his father before him and all that kind of stuff. All of that had a very Scottish feel to me, and that was emphasised when they went out and they met. Paul came and met him at the Duke's father's grave.
Yep.
The scenery is very Scottish. The landscape is very Scottish. The lakes and the mountains and all that kind of stuff. And so when the bagpipes came out, I was just like, yes, that actually really works. So, that worked for me. I thought it was a nice touch. And it added to that thing of what I was talking about before, the contrast between them and the Harkonnens. It made them feel even more human, like it was something that we could connect to from Earth. And I think that kind of just emphasized the difference between the two houses more than anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It worked really well. I loved it. I keep saying that. It worked really well. Everything worked really well. Lots of things in this movie worked really well for me.
No, totally agree. One thing I couldn't help but have a bit of a laugh. So, as I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of the 84 movie. And, of course, they did a lot of voiceovers for representing people's thoughts. And so when the Hunter Seeker appears in Paul's chambers, right, and, of course, Paul just stands there and there's no other sounds. The thing's just buzzing around. And I'm just thinking in the back of my head, it's like, I remember the dialogue here. It's like, hold still. If I don't move, it won't see me and all sort of thing. And I'm thinking, what if the audience is picking up on the fact that he can't move because it registers movement, right? So he said, I could yell for help, but it'll attack whoever opens the door. And, of course, that's what happens in the scene. And I thought, that's probably one instance where a voiceover probably wouldn't have hurt for anybody who's completely oblivious to saying, why does the thing just kill him?
No. I disagree. I didn't remember that there was a voiceover in that part of the movie, and it absolutely worked. It was obvious to me that he needed to freeze, and it was obvious to me that it was going to try and kill him. I don't think you needed the voiceover at all. I think that, again, that worked really well for me.
Yeah, it's the Blade Runner curse. That. If you watch the early versions of Blade Runner, you can't get the voices. You literally can't get the voices out of your head. What can I say? Hey, so there you go.
Yeah.
And you are right. And the slow blade penetrates the shield. So Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
whole shield concept. Yeah, it was different. It was, I mean, the 84 version was all very blocky and all the rest of it, and this one was a bit more
blocky.
subtle.
Yeah,
So I was surprised that
yeah.
the Baron had his own shield though. That one I didn't see. I thought, oh, okay, I thought it was an Atreides thing.
Really?
Or certainly the Baron wouldn't happen, but anyway, it worked. So yeah, very very good. All right, so we're going to finish up in a few ticks. So the second movie, which will probably be out in a couple of years because they haven't even started filming the damn thing yet. What are your expectations? And
Oh
what are you looking
wow.
forward to seeing?
Well, the riding the worms. I mean, we got a tiny little hint of it at the end of this one.
Mm,
It's going to be really interesting to see what that looks like. Um, I mean, we didn't even talk about how the worms were presented in
mm,
this movie, and I thought it was just brilliant. Um, there were just little details that worked really well. And so that's something I'm looking forward to. And the relationship between Paul and Shani as well
mm.
will be interesting to see how that develops. You can kind of see hints of it there already, but that'll be interesting. Yeah, I don't. There's a lot to come, and it'll be interesting to see what they do bring in and what they don't. I think you were talking about the water of life earlier and needing to bring that in. I think they'll just skip it altogether. I just think they won't bother with it for this story. The way they've set it up, it doesn't seem necessary anymore. So there are things like that I think we just won't ever see. It'll be interesting. I'm interested to see whether we find out about the guild, because that, I mean, it didn't even get a mention at all, if I remember. So it'll be interesting to see if that gets brought in. I can see scope for it. Like I can see how they could do it and where it would fit, but it'll be interesting to see whether they choose to do that or not. But the writing's the thing that I'm keen to see how they do. That'll be really interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because when Paul, because we already know the story, eventually does become the Kwisatz Haderach, changes everything. The entire Imperium changes overnight when he becomes the big cheese, as it were, and it goes on beyond the movie, of course, as to what happens regarding that. So, I mean, clearly they didn't introduce the Emperor in this; they've kept the Emperor out. So who knows who's playing the Emperor, how that's going to be sort of shown, and how far they push it. And like Princess Irulan, who of course becomes Paul's concubine. I think it's the wife. Yeah, Chani doesn't become the wife. Irulan does. She hasn't even appeared yet. And also her whole story's been omitted so far as well. So be curious to see whether they have the scenario where it all fits in beautifully or whether they just have to jam pack it all in together and see how they go with that.
Or what they leave out.
Yeah, and of course, one thing we haven't, like, the idea of like changing the face of Arrakis, making it all green. I mean, ironically, in the 84 movie, it rained at the end of the movie, and I thought, you can't have that because that just kills all the worms. But let's not worry about that, shall we? So there you go. Yeah, there you go. So good old Floyd, our number one American fan. Glad he's sitting for the show. Look, all things being equal, I think it's a great film. They've done a really, really good job with it. They've had to sort of make a few changes to the story to make it work, because otherwise it would be too big and too cumbersome, and I get that. I think if you're watching it for the first time and didn't know the story, there's enough there to get a grasp as to what's going on. Maybe some of the omissions are a bit unfortunate because the scope is so big, but from a cinematic and narrative level, you kind of need to sort of just do that. Otherwise, people's brains are going to explode. And that was the problem the 84 movie had. It would try to jam in so much that if you'd never read the book, you had no hope. From the opening sequence, you're lost. And it was a real pity because they had so much detail put into it that it was completely unfortunate. And of course, you had the miniseries that was produced in 2000, which a lot of people said was superior to the 84 movie, but it was too much like the books. And once again, it was just a bit of a mind overload. So at least with this version, I think if you've never read the books, and ironically you haven't, people could sort of get a grasp of it. So it's kind of cool. So, and Floyd has said he has actually seen the other versions. So very, very good. What do you reckon?
Cool. I think the other thing about this one is it's worth seeing in the cinema. Like, it's worth seeing on a really properly big screen. So if you get a chance, I think you should absolutely do it.
Yep, totally agree with you on that one. Anyway, so we're going to wrap this one up for the night. So the important thing is the spice must flow, which is a critical thing in the entire story, right? That it must flow. That's the end of that's absolutely critical. So we'll have to wait for a couple of years to see what the next movie's like. But so far for this one, they've done very, very well. What do you reckon, Miss Claire? Any final words before we sign off for tonight?
Completely agree. No, I completely agree. I think you should go see it. I think everyone should go see it and see it at the cinemas. It's worth it. It's beautiful.
Yep, totally agree.
and easily followed. Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Yep.
Good stuff. No dramas. All right. And if you do happen to see it, you want to come back and talk to us about it, by all means do so. So very, very cool. All right. Just wait for all those Dune toys and collectibles to come out. Oh, yeah, that'll be the next big thing. So there you go. All right. We're going to buzz off now. We'll see you all next week. And for now, we'll leave you to it. So if you're going to see the Dune, make sure you see it in the zone. All right. Okay. Take care. Bye for now.
Okay.